World News Today, brought to you by the Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
The Russians have reached Romania. Marshal Stalin announced a few minutes ago that Soviet troops have reached the Prut River frontier of Romania on a front of almost 53 miles long. They've captured the Bessarabian rail junction of Belzi. Large forces of American bombers were out again today, pounding Europe into shape for invasion. In the Pacific, our planes have raided Rabaul again without meeting Jap resistance, and in India, heavy fighting is reported on the Manipur plain, with the Japanese only 34 miles from Impaul. And now for our first report direct from overseas and news of the fighting in Italy, Admiral takes you to Naples. Eric Severide reporting.
The situation on all three Italian fronts, Cassino, Anzio, and Vesuvius, is quite static tonight. Nothing happened at Cassino save artillery fire. At the beachhead, a British destroyer shelled German positions, and Mount Vesuvius seems to be subsiding a bit after taking 26 human lives. You have heard about the daring assault of Monastery Hill at Cassino by a small number of Allied troops who found themselves pinned down there by German fire. Their communication with the rear were almost entirely cut off. First, we tried to send in runners on foot carrying packs. They didn't all come back. Then headquarters turned to the Air Force. One of the flyers of the 86th Fighter Bomber Group who came to the rescue is here now to explain a bit how this novel operation was carried out. He is Lieutenant Ed Lucas of Greensboro, North Carolina.
Well, we fly A-36 Invaders. I've been out dropping bombs and strafing on nearly 50 missions over here. But this was the first time I'd ever tried dropping packages by parachute. It's a lot different and it's pretty tricky.
Well, just what's the process?
The first part is simple coming up to Cassino. There's seldom any opposition over that stretch. Then we swung in on Cassino. We went in 2 planes at a time. Carried the bales under the wing, one on each side. You just pull the bomb release and the parachutes open on a static line.
Well, how high are you?
I think I was usually around 100 feet above the ground. As a matter of fact, we were below the German gun positions on top of the hill. We had to come in at relatively slow speed, or we'd never hit the proper spot.
And could you actually see those maroon men on the hillsides?
I just got a glimpse of them once. 2 men were running bent over, going for a chute bundle on the ground nearby. They were keeping low to stay out of the line of German fire. Must have been in a shallow ditch. Mostly, however, the place looked like it's all dirt and rock. I don't see how they find any cover at all.
And did you yourself catch much fire from the Germans?
Just small arms fire and a few bursts of ack-ack, which bumped my plane a bit. As a matter of fact, I was much more scared of hitting the hill. We had to fly in through the pole from our own infantry smoke pot barrage on the ground.
And did the men get all the supplies you dropped?
I think most of it, certainly. We flew 183 sorties in all and delivered 324 packages of food and water, shells, grenades, and landmines and small ammunition. There were some Indian troops there who eat a lot of fish and rice, and they got that from us, too.
Well, it was a dangerous and a useful piece of work.
Well, you know, we didn't consider it so dangerous. In fact, it seemed so easy that we passed the job around, so as many pilots as possible could chalk up a mission to their credit.
We return you now to CBS in New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Corporation.
How would you like to own a home freezer that will keep you supplied all winter long with fresh vegetables from your victory garden? Or an electric range that will automatically make the coffee while you take your morning shower? Or an electric refrigerator with equally new and exciting features? These are not idle dreams, but predictions of good things to come from Admiral. Since Pearl Harbor, yes, and even before, Admiral has cooperated aggressively with the war production program. To meet the ever-increasing demands for electronic equipment, manufacturing facilities have grown with Jack and the Beanstalk rapidity, and production has kept pace. For example, In 1943, output of war material topped Admiral's biggest peacetime year by 90%, and output this year will be twice that of 1943. When Admiral's wartime obligations have been fulfilled, this tremendously increased ability to produce will present both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge to provide jobs for our homecoming men, an opportunity to realize long-cherished plans and ambitions. When that time comes, Admiral will proudly present a line of major household appliances designed, developed, and engineered by men with years of know-how. There will be an Admiral electric refrigerator, an Admiral home freezer, an Admiral electric range, each with new and exciting features for more enjoyable living, each a worthy companion to the radio that has become America's smart set. Now, here once again is Doug Edwards.
For news of the home front, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington. Don Pryor reporting.
Congress has only 4 more days to go before the Easter recess. In that time, it's just possible that final action will be taken on the GI Bill of Rights, providing all sorts of benefits for war veterans. But most of the big controversial issues will wait until the legislators come back on April 12th. These include extension of the Stabilization Act and related questions of subsidies and the Little Steel wage formula, the labor draft question, and possibly another effort to outlaw poll taxes. There's likely to be a little political flavor in all this. In fact, a good many congressmen and senators are up for re-election and have already left their legislative duties and gone home to mend their political fences. And political observers here, by the way, are watching next Tuesday's election in Oklahoma with more than usual interest. It may show which way the political wind is blowing along the border states. It's a special election to pick a congressman in the 2nd Oklahoma district. But even more important, probably, although the outcome is not so doubtful, will be New York State's presidential primaries also next Tuesday. Governor Dewey still gives the impression that he isn't a candidate, but his backers are confident that they will pick up at least 90% of New York's delegates to the Republican convention in Chicago. I return you to Admiral Radio in New York.
American bombers were over France again today. For this news and an interview with a Flying Fortress crew chief from Liberty, Kentucky, Admiral takes you to CBS London, Larry LeSueur reporting.
The coming of spring has brought payoff time to the exponents of victory through air power. The air battle must be won before the land battle can begin. And the American Air Force in Britain is in the midst of the greatest campaign it may ever fight, breaking the German Air Force. Again today, for the 20th time this month, America's fortresses and liberators have challenged the Luftwaffe. Our planes come home at dusk riddled by flak and cannon fire. But they must be fit to fly again at dawn. Behind this American record for sustained operations are the almost forgotten men, the ground crews, the mechanics who keep them flying. Tonight we have with us Master Sergeant Omer James of Liberty, Kentucky. 2 years ago, Sergeant James ran a general store on the edge of the Bluegrass. Today, he's crew chief of a flying fortress. He and his crew of mechanics have been cited by Bomber Command for sending out their fortress on over 40 combat missions without a single mechanical failure. Sergeant James, what shift do you work up at the airfield?
We don't work any shift, Larry. We work until the job is finished. Generally, we start at dusk when the bombers return and work through until dawn next day. Once I work 72 hours straight.
Gosh, any strikes at your field, Sergeant?
No. The only time we ever complain is when a fort returns without dropping its bombs.
Well, what's an average day like in the life of a fortress mechanic, Sergeant James?
Well, I think you'd call it more night than day. When the forts go out, we go to bed. And when they come home, we go to work. Work all night, just using flashlights and portable lights. And, boy, it was pretty unpleasant on those English fields this winter.
Yeah, I'll bet that cold went right through you.
No. The cold didn't go through us. Some of it stayed inside. But now that spring is here, we can work much faster. There's more daylight now. We had so much experience in the last 9 months that we can do in 3 hours what used to take us a day.
See, what's the name of your particular fortress, Sergeant James?
Well, it used to be called the Screaming Red. Luckiest ship on the field. Went out on 45 missions, and none of her combat crew ever got a scratch. But she didn't come back from the 46th. That was Berlin. We waited out on the field until dusk for about an hour after the rest of the planes were home. And then we heard the bad news. Flak got her over the big city. can't tell you how I felt. We were all pretty silent. After 9 months, Screaming Red and her crew were gone.
We're all sorry, Sergeant James, but we know that it costs men and planes to break the Luftwaffe. And that soon you'll have another chance to break the American Air Force record for keeping them flying. We return you now to New York.
As we said earlier, Russian troops have reached the Romanian frontier to create new problems for the German command. And tonight in Moscow, the victory guns are booming. For an analysis of the situation on the Eastern Front, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The crucial point in the Russian fighting is now the Romanian rail center of Cernati. This town, the capital of Bukovina, controls the two mainline railways which feed the whole of eastern Romania and form the only direct connections between Germany and the armies of Field Marshal von Manstein. If Cernati is taken by the Russians, these armies will be dependent on circuitous lines of railway running through Hungary, with the single exception of a rather poor line through the Jablanica Pass. The fall of Cernati should spell disaster for these German armies. And Cernati is in very real danger. With the collapse of German resistance at Proskirov and the encirclement of the town of Kamenets-Podolsky, the Russian armies of Marshal Zhukov have reached the upper Dniester River on a broad front, with good communications behind them. They are at this point only 25 miles distant from Cernati. Front reports say that tanks and trucks with lights blazing in order to make better time rolled all night from the Bug to the Dniester. This suggests that the Russians are now indifferent to the German Air Force, which is so largely occupied in defending western Germany against the powerful bombing attacks from the British Isles. Meanwhile, at the central part of the southern front, the Russians under General Konev have smashed through the Dniester barrier and have driven clear through to the Prut River, the border of Romania proper, on a 53-mile front. It would appear that von Manstein's group of armies may be in danger of being broken up into small, separated groups and thus destroyed in detail. Certainly very large numbers of German troops are still east of the Dniester, some even east of the Bug. The possibility that these troops may escape the vast Russian encircling movements grows less with every day of Russian progress. Where only a few days ago we were thinking somewhat hopefully of a Russian encircling movement between the Bug and the Dniester, we can now envisage the possibility of such a drive much farther west, between the Prut and the Carpathians. And if such a move could be completed, it would encircle and entrap the whole of the German armies within its grasp.
That was Major George Fielding Elliott. With the election on the horizon and millions of American troops scattered all over the world, there's a very big job to be done informing those men and women of the issues in the campaigns. To hear more about that, here is Bill Slocum, Jr.
The American soldier is the best fed, best equipped, and best paid fighting man in the world, which well he might be. He is also the best informed fighting man extant. For that he can thank first the American people, who would have it no other way, and then the Army Information Branch, which through its famous Army News Service sees to it that the GI in the Italian mud and the Pacific heat is fully and quickly informed of the fate of his favorite prize fighter in the ring, or his favorite movie star in the courtrooms of Hollywood, or how Main Street looks back home. With Election Day on the horizon, the job of the Army News Service becomes very intriguing indeed. To be very blunt about it, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. And if he isn't going to run for president, it's a cinch he'll be rooting for some man who does. I've asked Colonel Franklin S. Forsberg, officer in charge of the Army News Service, the famous Army newspaper Yank, and other troop information activities working from New York, to talk with us today about how the Army will handle campaign claims and facts. Not that they are necessarily related. Colonel Forsberg.
Every soldier or fighting man of any service will be told everything that happens in the campaign. He'll very often read it in Australia before you read it at breakfast. He'll read or hear his radio, all sides of the news from home, but with no interpretation. We'll tell them, and they'll make up their own minds.
No editorial comment?
None.
They're lucky. How will you tell the boys?
Army News Service is now sending out more than 65,000 words a day via Army Signal Corps, shortwave radio, and airmail pouch to more than 120 overseas points. Impartial, complete digests of all sorts of news are sent out twice a day from New York. The news is distributed all over the world in various overseas Army newspapers, radio stations, mimeograph reports, bulletin boards, or if none of these is available, the commanding officer will pass the important news on. We send out feature stories and pictures by airmail and also pictures by radio. ANS is a complete GI news agency.
Do you tell the boys everything?
We do.
How about the Patton incident?
Army News sent out a complete story on that from the time it broke in American papers. That goes for strikes, the soldier vote legislation, and such. We tell them what happened, who did what, and who said what. The individual private or general does his own interpretation.
Where do you get your news?
From the regular civilian news services and papers. We have it condensed by soldiers. Every ANS man is a soldier. They have all been newspaper men in civilian life. And when we picked the best we could from 30,000 reporters in the armed services. They're good reporters, and good reporters are impartial. And to make sure they are, we have other good editors check the work thoroughly. Everybody works under this order. Don't take sides. Send the troop all the news.
Thank you, Colonel Forsberg. This isn't objective reporting on my side, I'll admit. But I've read a lot of Army News Service stories, and I could find no more bias in them than I could in a bank statement. And now, back to Doug Edwards.
For news from the Pacific War Zone and an interview with a WAC corporal from Stamford, Connecticut, Admiral takes you after a few seconds' pause to CBS Pearl Harbor. Webley Edwards reporting.
The forward advances of our forces from the Southwest Pacific have given the Americans control of the Pacific Sea areas as far north as Truk. Admiral Nimitz' Pacific Fleet forces have demonstrated their control of the sea lanes from the Central Pacific as far west as Truk and as far north as the Marianas. And the Japs have, in effect, been pushed back to a defense perimeter only half as large as it was 4 months ago. The Japs' inability to supply their bypassed forces in the Marshalls and in the New Britain, New Guinea, Solomons area now virtually settles the fate of a good many thousand Jap troops. The eastern Carolines Islands of Ponape, Kusai, Pingalap are within distance of our heavy land-based bombers and have been bombed persistently. These bombings are a threat to the ships upon which these Caroline Islands depend for supplies, which makes it possible that even these eastern Caroline Islands may wither and die. Into the Pacific this week came the first contingent of WACs, women soldiers of the Women's Army Corps, attached to the Air Transport Command, AirWACs. And with me here at the Pacific Post is Corporal Leith Hamilton, age 28, of Stamford, Connecticut. Do I call you Miss Hamilton or Corporal?
Just Corporal.
Well, how does it feel to be out here in the combat zone, Corporal?
This is what we've been training for. We volunteered for overseas duty. Back in the States, we knew we were doing a job, just as thousands of WACs there are doing now. But out here, we are so close to the real thing that it gives us more of a feeling of active participation. I've never seen anything like this place in my life. There certainly is a big war going on out here.
Are you married, Corporal?
Yes. My husband is Lieutenant John A. Hamilton of the Air Transport Command. He's the best navigator in the North Atlantic Wing.
Why, naturally. Tell me, do the other WACs have any dates with the GIs around these here parts?
Yes, they're allowed to have dates, but they must go out in groups of at least 4, and they can't have dates with officers. The girls hit it off very well with their brother soldiers, and they've already met some enlisted men they used to know back home. They're very careful of us out in this man's country, though, which is all right with us.
Who checks up on the guards?
Captain, don't worry.
All right. What's your particular job, Corporal Hamilton?
I'm a motor driver. Anything from a 2.5-ton truck on down to a Jeep. We came out here to relieve men to go on active duty, and it's really happening. I'm glad to say that the man whose place I have taken has already received his orders to go.
And that's one of the newly arrived airWACs in the Pacific, Corporal Leith Hamilton, now taking a male truck driver's place in the combat zone. This is Webley Edwards at a Central Pacific airfield, returning you to Admiral Radio in New York.
And now for an interview with a Navy lieutenant from Miami who participated in some of our biggest attacks in the Pacific. Admiral takes you back to Washington. Don Pryor reporting.
Here's a man who has dropped bombs on the Japanese all over the South and Central Pacific, including Saipan, just 1,200 miles south of Tokyo. He's Lieutenant J.G. James P. Scherer, USN, a torpedo bomber pilot. We'll begin at Kwajalein, Jim. Which island there did you attack?
Roy, that's at the north of the atoll.
Was there much opposition in the air?
Some the first day, but the real job at Kwajalein was done by the fleet's big guns and by the ground troops. After the second day, we just kept hauling bombs in support of the landing force.
And then what?
We went after Truck next. And from what we had heard about Truck, it was like being told to attack a machine gun with a razor blade.
Well, but it turned out a little bit softer, didn't it?
No, actually it didn't. A lot of people here seem to think that Truck was a fizzle. The Jap fleet didn't happen to be there, but it's about the toughest position I've ever seen. And they threw up more anti-aircraft than you could shake a stick at. We sank 23 Jap ships and destroyed just under 300 planes. Just those figures ought to prove that it isn't a pushover.
Well, I should think so. Will you tell us about the attack as you saw it?
I saw Truck for the first time about 9:30 in the morning. Some ships had been sunk already. Others were burning, and some were trying to get underway. Our target was a cargo ship. I was concentrating on that and only saw 3 planes. My turret gunner, A.J. Myers, got one of them on the way out. Those gunners, incidentally, are a good form of life insurance.
Did you get a hit?
Yes, we hit him on the stern.
Well, your next attack, wasn't it, was at Saipan in the Marianas, and you didn't surprise the Japs when you went there, did you?
No, that was the first raid we made where we were picked up before we got to the target. They spotted us about 4:30 in the afternoon, and they gave us hell all night and up to about 9:30 the next morning. None of us could sleep, of course, so we went topside and spent the night in the ready room. It looked like a 4th of July celebration. The Japs kept coming in waves. The sky was full of tracers and exploding shells, and now and then you'd see a big flash of fire and a ball of flame would drop into the sea. About 17 of them were shot down.
Well, how about the raid itself, Jim?
Well, the fighters went in first and shot down several Jap planes and strafed their fields. My group took off about 8 o'clock in the morning. The Jap bombers were still coming after our carriers, and while we circled, the Ack-Ack and fighters shot down several more of them. We came over Saipan about 9 o'clock. It's a beautiful little island covered with trees and cane fields, and there's a pretty fair-sized town of several thousand people. We didn't hit that. Our target was an airfield, and we got about 5 Jap planes on the ground. But we missed most of the fun because the Japs tried to dive bomb our carrier while we were gone. But they didn't get a hit. There was another run later in the day, but it didn't get in on that. They went after the only ship in the harbor and shot up a few small boats.
Well, Jim, you look awfully healthy for a man who's been through all that. Have you ever been wounded?
Once. I was shot down in the raid on Rabaul, and a sailor's helmet fell off when he leaned over to pull me aboard a destroyer. The helmet hit me on the head.
Well, in other words, a helmet can dish it out as well as take it. I return you now to Admiral Radio in New York.
In closing, we'd like to remind you that Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain will speak to the world from London this afternoon, and his address will be heard over the Columbia Network at 4 p.m. Eastern Wartime. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Corporation.
In the months prior to Pearl Harbor, the personal or camera-type radio was rapidly gaining favor with the American public. Small enough and lightweight enough to carry alone or packed in luggage, the Admiral Bantam was the reigning favorite among camera-type radios. For despite its small size, the Admiral Bantam produces plenty of volume and excellent tone. Operating equally well on alternating or direct house currents or self-contained batteries, there are never any power blackouts with the Admiral Bantam. The Bantam is just one member of the large family of Admiral Radio, America's smart set, and they'll all be back when war clouds lift. The Admiral radios of the post-war era will be finer because of the improvements perfected and the experience gained in building wartime communications equipment. Yes, great things are brewing in the modern plants of Admiral Corporation, world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. The appearance of personnel of the armed services on this program does not necessarily constitute an endorsement of our product. The home front pledge is, I will pay my ration points in full, and I will pay no more than ceiling prices. As you know, there is a ceiling price for almost every food you buy. These ceiling prices don't cover just meat and canned goods. They also are in effect on staples like bread, cereals, eggs, soap. In fact, almost everything that goes into your market basket. Know your ceiling prices and pay no more. It's the fair way. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by the Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, Admiral Refrigerators, Admiral Home Freezer, Admiral Electric Range. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. Warren Sweeney speaking. This is CBS, the